Again, the New Testament did not drop down from heaven into a publishing warehouse at some point. Um, it did not come bound from heaven in the shape of Codex Sinaiticus or something similar. God used historical circumstances and historical people, individuals like you and me, to convey His word.
This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible Sojourner, and today we are starting a series that I'm really excited for, and we're going to be talking about the New Testament and how we got our New Testaments and some of the background issues that maybe you've never thought about before. And in order to think about these issues, I've actually invited a special guest and a good friend of mine, Denis Salgado. And the best claim to fame that I have in my life, probably of all time, is that I used to be a semi-consistent tennis partner for Denis Salgado. And so that's my claim to fame before he became, in this world of textual criticism and understanding the origin of the New Testament, all of those things. So I somehow convinced him through promising, a couple extra tennis games that he could come on the podcast and talk. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Denis Salgado.
Thank you, Peter. It's a joy for me to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Also, thank you for playing tennis matches with me a few years ago. I do miss those. Hopefully, we'll get to do that again. I'm looking forward to spending, a few hours talking about the issue of the New Testament, how we got the New Testament. I had a privilege to get to know Pete a few years ago at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. That's where I went to get my Master of Divinity, and that's where I was also introduced to New Testament textual criticism under the leadership of one of the professors over there, Andy Smith, and that set me down that track of looking at manuscripts and comparing the texts of those manuscripts. So I ended up doing something that I never anticipated, which was to get a PhD in New Testament and Christian origins at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. I did not want to do that. I just wanted to go back to my home country, Brazil, to keep doing ministry, pastoral ministry, and perhaps teach at undergraduate level. But I guess the Lord had different ideas for my life. So my wife and I, we moved to the UK in 2019, and I got my PhD. And that gave me different opportunities to serve the church in ways that I never thought about. And one way is precisely this. I've been working now for almost 3 years at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which was founded by Dan Wallace, famous Dan Wallace, who's debated with Bart Ehrman a few times and is the author of several books, and especially the Greek grammar that's been used widely in seminary. So Dr. Dan Wallace founded the center, CSNTM, in 2002 to digitally preserve New Testament Greek manuscripts, and we've been doing that since. So it's a nice thing that we get to do, just travel to different locations across the world, examine these beautiful artifacts, pieces of history, and then make sure they are photographed properly and made accessible online for researchers and people who are not researchers but want to know more about, the history of their New Testament. And we have also, as a staff, designed this curriculum here, text to translation, the story of the New Testament, to reach a different audience. People at large in the church do have this question: is my New Testament reliable? Can I trust these words? How do I know that these words are actually the words that the apostles wrote? So we have taken on this task to just present the data, present the history. What can we learn from history, from the data available to us to answer that question? And sneak peek, yes, the New Testament that you were reading today is reliable, okay? you can trust those words, and we'll show that history for you in this curriculum.
Oh, that is perfect. That is such a great intro. And I love that because, I often try to get the guests to introduce themselves a little bit, like where they come from, what their passions are, just to help people be able to pay attention to these new guys that they're listening to. So thanks for sharing that with us. And, it really is such a benefit to the church. I've gotten so many questions on YouTube or people reaching out through my website, just asking questions about manuscripts or questions about how we can have confidence in God's word. And I think this is such a valuable area of study. And the difficulty though is that it's not one that you can just, you know, find in an internet, forum or something like that. You get a lot of crazy information on the internet. And so to be able to go to the original sources to see the actual manuscripts and be able to, make observations about the pages themselves. I know you were telling me about some of the articles that you had been working through specific manuscripts, noting some of the differences from other manuscripts. Just a really great service to the church. So thanks. And we want to benefit from that. So to start us off, we're just going to be talking in broad picture about, like you said, this series that you guys have been working on, this text to translation series, and how we got the New Testament. So a lot of people read their Bibles, they read their English Bibles. They don't really know kind of the big picture story about how we got our English Bibles. And that actually starts a long way prior to even the Bible being translated into the English language. So I'm going to jump in periodically if I think that there's going to be some helpful clarification or something. But without further ado, can you just start us off with this introductory idea of where should we start in thinking about how we got our New Testament?
Yes. So, of course, in order to get to that translation, of course, the English translation that we are using daily in our lives, before we get to that, uh, we would recommend that we start at the very beginning, right? The things, the documents, the artifacts that set the whole story in motion. So it's not sufficient for us to start whether it's a few centuries before the Reformation, William Tyndale. It's not sufficient to start with that. It's not sufficient for us to start with the medieval times and the manuscripts that exist over there, or even the 4th century, where you can get those beautiful manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, right? It's important for us to go back to the 1st century, to the autographs, the original manuscripts, which were composed in a very specific context, right? The Greco-Roman context. And um, we usually say here at the center, one of the lines that my colleagues, one of my colleagues has is, people think that their English Bibles dropped, from heaven into a Zondervan or Crossway warehouse, which obviously is not true. Everything started yes, God was supervising everything that was being recorded, but those things were composed by humans, right? By people like you and me, used by God, and the content was carefully crafted under God's direction in a specific human and historical setting. So it's necessary for us to go back to that 1st century, to the Greco-Roman setting, and see if we can glean some insights from the compositional and publishing practices of the time, and see how those might play out in the composition of the New Testament, or the writings that later formed what we know as the New Testament. So let's, if that's all good with you, Pete, I'll just start over here with our first lesson. As you can see here, the question that we are trying to answer is, how did we get the New Testament, right? That is the big question for the whole series that we have designed, and it's problematic because the church at large lacks knowledge of this story. People have misleading ideas about the New Testament and don't ask questions, and this actually undercuts our ability to use the New Testament for worship, for instruction, and for our own lives. So before we go any further, let's just talk about an approach, right? CSNTM's approach, the approach of the Center for the Study of the New Testament Manuscripts, is not necessarily apologetics, although we provide the ammo, right, for apologists, for people who want to push, a specific narrative when it comes to the New Testament. We provide the data. We provide the scientific data and how we can draw conclusions from that very carefully. And the apologists will use that data to defend the Christian faith in its various aspects. So it is more data driven, okay, than apologetics driven. And we seek to go where the evidence will lead us. We believe that all truth belongs to God, right? And God is the God of truth. So if we pursue truth, we will find that God is actually behind everything the whole time. So, what this does, right, for us when we pursue data, is that for one thing, it shakes us out of our of absolute skepticism. We can know a lot, right, from um, centuries past. We can do practice this archaeology or manuscript studies, all those sciences, and learn about how these people lived, how they practiced their religion, how they composed their books, how they transmitted their valuable religious literature. So things are within our reach. We need to study. We need to excavate those things. So there's no need for us to fall in this ditch of absolute skepticism. Now, when we approach this question of the New Testament from the data perspective, we also believe that it will shake us out of absolute certainty. Now, let me nuance this for you. I'm not saying we cannot know for sure that what we have now is what the apostles wrote then, but every single historical endeavor based on data, right, will be limited. Okay, there are limitations involved in the kind of data that we can extract and the conclusions that we can draw from those. All right, so uh, data is lacking, for instance, from the first century in the sense of manuscript evidence. So we don't have the autographs. As far as we know, they're not extant. So the data is limited in that regard. The data is also limited in the second century for us. There are um, papyri manuscripts or fragments which are dated, from the second to the third century, especially things such as Papyrus 52, the earliest evidence for what we know as the Gospel of John. But other than a few fragments, data is limited. Direct evidence for the Greek New Testament or books of the New Testament is limited for that century. That is not to say that we don't have references in the church fathers or the apostolic fathers, or even translations, versions from Latin into Latin and Syriac and Coptic. But when it comes to the Greek evidence, it's a little bit sparse for that century, direct evidence. So that is when we talk about absolute certainty, there are points in history where the data will stop, right? And we have to stop as well as a center and this historical endeavor, which is data driven. We stop over there, but you are welcome to draw further conclusions if you are comfortable with that.
Now, let me jump in there too, Dennis, because I think that's an important point to just really emphasize when you're talking about, getting us away from absolute skepticism. I think everybody's okay with that, but then the idea of getting away from absolute certainty, some people are going to pause on that, and we had talked about that earlier a little bit. And what you're not saying is that, and you did say this, so I just want to really emphasize, you're not saying that we can't have certainty. It's just that we need to also understand that given what the New Testament evidence has, and you're going to go through this later on, but you're going to talk about all the different variations of how the scribes did different things. And so when we have manuscripts, we don't have the originals today. So you're looking at a wide variety of manuscripts that are done by different scribes, and sometimes they make mistakes. And so sometimes you're going to have a variety of evidence, but and I don't want to put words in my mouth, so you clarify if I'm misrepresenting you. What you're saying is that even in instances where there are a wide variety of evidence, we can say, okay, we, based on the evidence, would be able to say that this is the reading of the New Testament. And so we can be sure about that. But at the same time, we're talking about in a data driven environment, not every manuscript has the exact same thing. There are variations within those manuscripts, and we just need to be okay with that so that when somebody goes to college and somebody says, did you know that this passage in your English Bible isn't actually in this very valuable manuscript? People aren't surprised by that kind of information. Is that a fair kind of assessment?
Yes, that is correct. We have enough evidence to arrive at a safe conclusion, a secure conclusion about the reliability of the New Testament. But, and as you said, this in this data-driven environment and this kind of inquiry, we will run into those into limitations when it comes to the data. I grew up in an environment where absolute certainty was something that I was pursuing and that I was taught. So um, and that's very common in the church. So whenever you come across what you raised over there, Pete, perhaps in college or from a YouTuber or something, that oh no, your New Testament is contradictory. You have these things here in Mark that are not, that are that are contrary to what Matthew has recorded, or manuscripts have so many discrepancies. People lose their faith and they fall into desperation, right? Because they have been they've been pursuing this absolute certainty where the data does not allow us to go there because the data is limited, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is the point that we like to make in this data-driven quest. Okay, so this data-driven approach, right? It does two things, as we're saying. It shakes us out of absolute skepticism and shakes us out of absolute certainty, and it gives us significant confidence that what we have now is what the apostles wrote then. But even in this data-driven environment and this data-driven quest, there will be a point where we will be required to exercise faith, right? As any other thing in Christian life, we will have to exercise faith. Now, when we look at the data for the Greek New Testament tradition and carefully parse things out, we realize that what we as Christians need to do, what is required of us, is not to take a blind leap of faith, right? But an informed step of faith. So when it comes to our trust and confidence that what we have now is what the apostles wrote then, I do not need to take a blind leap of faith because we have data, we have hard data and hard evidence, right? And this data set, this evidence substantiates, my belief, right, that the New Testament is reliable. So my faith is informed by the data, okay? And think of a jury, right, and a judge and a disquisition, by prosecutors and all those involved in the court of law. What we are doing is summoning witnesses of the New Testament Greek tradition, right? Looking at the text that they have transmitted. So we're looking at these things and trying to arrive at a conclusion. Is it reasonable to believe that the New Testament is reliable? Is it beyond reasonable doubt? And we say definitely yes, looking at all the evidence that we have, beyond reasonable doubt, what we have now is what the apostles wrote then. Now, it's interesting because we do exercise this kind of faith in our daily lives, right? I just flew the other day to do some speaking engagement in Tennessee, and I bought my plane ticket, got to the airport after facing crazy traffic here in Dallas. So got to the airport, went through that amazing, security checkpoint, and went to my gate, hopped on the plane, no questions asked, right? I never stopped and asked, hey, where are the engineers? Where are all the mechanics? I want to make sure that everybody has been certified, right?
Right.
I want to make sure that everybody's up to date in their studies and everybody has a clear mind over here. And they've done all the maintenance necessary for this plane to function properly. And by the way, pilot, let me talk to you. Where did you get your training? Where did you go to school? How many hours do you have, flying? How many years of experience? No, we exercise faith when we stop and think about it every day in our lives. It's beyond reasonable doubt, right? That it is okay for me to just buy my plane ticket and believe that the plane has been, serviced properly, that the pilots have proper training, and that everything's going to function correctly and take me to my destination safely. So we exercise faith without thinking about it every day in our lives. So why does it have to be different when it comes to the New Testament? Why do I have to um, perhaps even pursue that absolute certainty where the data does not exist when we don't practice the same thing for other things in life? So we wouldn't be able to function in life if we didn't have the belief aspect. But the most important thing is that it is reasonable to believe that, that airplane pilot has proper training and that everybody is qualified to be there to take me safely home. So the same way, it is reasonable to believe, based on the all the evidence that we have, that the New Testament is reliable. Okay, so faith is not the issue. Faith is not the issue. The question is my faith placed in something reasonable or unreasonable? Okay. And we will see that once everything is said and done, the evidence clearly tells us, right, that we can reasonably believe that what we have now is what the apostles wrote then. So the first step again is looking at the autographs, the letters that started everything for the New Testament. How did we get from Jesus walking the earth to the writing of the books that make up our New Testament? What is the nature of these autographs, these books of the New Testament? So we will look at this content, the autographs, in two parts. First, the writing world of the New Testament, so the people who composed documents in the time of the New Testament, in ways that differ from what we are used to in our days, right? And the process of publishing in the first century. Again, first century publishing practices differ from what we practice today. And the goal is to present the historically grounded nature of the writings of the New Testament. Okay. Dispel any idea that the composition of the New Testament was not historically grounded. Again, the New Testament did not drop down from heaven into a publishing warehouse at some point. Um, it did not come bound from heaven in the shape of Codex Sinaiticus or something similar. Now, this does not mean that the New Testament in the first century, uh, and you're going to have your theological discussions about this, but it does not mean that we don't believe that, the autographs were not inspired, but that God used historical circumstances and historical people, individuals like you and me, to convey His word, and in a very real sense, right? Jesus, or the second person of the Trinity, took on flesh. He is the incarnate Word. And we don't have any issue with that. We believe it as revealed in Scripture, but He took on flesh. He became human, right? And God has chosen to convey His written word, His verbal word, right, in a written form through human agency. Okay. So God has been acting that way throughout history. When you look back to the nation of Israel, and when you look at the person of Christ himself, taking on the human form of Jesus, and then you have God unfolding his plan through the church today. And so God has been working throughout history through human agency, and this is no different. Now, we no longer have the autographs as far as we know. What we have are copies of those autographs. And we at CSNTM want to understand what the autographs once said. So the best place to start is, of course, with the autograph. So just a brief definition of what is an autograph. You might be a sports fan,
Mhm.
but, the autograph is not something that we were talking about, is not, you running to the basketball court and getting an autograph of your favorite player on your basketball or your jersey. That's not what we're talking about. The autograph that we are talking about here is the author approved document that was sent out by the author and then later circulated. Okay, that is the definition that we have for the autograph of a book that later comprised the New Testament. So let's take a look at how things were done around the time of the New Testament in what is known as antiquity and late antiquity. The New Testament does provide us with, some hints, and it's not extensive, but there are some ideas. So Paul's letter to the Romans, for instance, we read at the very end in Romans 16:22 that it was Tertius who wrote this letter. So I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. So was it Paul who wrote the letter, or was it Tertius? You go to the beginning of Romans, you have, Paul, an apostle, servant of Jesus Christ, and he keeps going. Is it Paul or is it Tertius, the author of Romans? And the answer is yes, it's both, okay? Because Paul, through divine superintendence, is providing the content, and Tertius is the one executing that on the writing surface. Okay, so he's the one writing it, but the content comes from God through Paul. So what we have here is the practice of amanuenses, or a secretary, which seems to have been very common. We know that Peter may have used an amanuensis as well. So we read in 1 Peter 5:12, that he may have dictated that too. So it was more common than perhaps we imagine. Paul also tells us that he would often finish his letters in a specific way, right? With reference to his own hand. This is how I sign my letters. This is how I write. This is my handwriting. 2 Thessalonians 3:17, Colossians 4:18, 1 Corinthians 16:21, Philemon 19:19, Galatians 6:11. It's funny because Galatians, he talks about his issues with his eyesight. And um, some people think, hey, if one day we find Galatians, the autographs of Galatians, maybe we're gonna see a difference in the size of the letters at the very end, because Paul is, has an issue with his vision over there, so he's
Right.
gonna write in larger letters. He mentions that. Well, even if we find, let's say, a Galatians that has that feature, how would we know that was not a copy that emulated the original? So
Sure.
it's hard to make sure that something is the original. But anyway, going back to the point in question, the convention that we have in the New Testament seems to have been, that you are the author of that book, but it was very common for you to use a secretary to pen the content. Okay. Paul would deliver his letters to churches, right, by entrusting those letters to messengers. They would take then those letters to those people. So, um, letter carriers, right? That was a very common thing. Perhaps Paul is in Corinth, writing a letter to a different church elsewhere. Um, but he cannot carry the letter himself. He cannot be absent from Corinth. So he will use an entrusted messenger to bring that letter over to that church. So, for instance, Colossians 4, 7, and 8, we read that Tychicus will tell you all about my activities. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. So, he is the one who is carrying the letter to the Colossians. And we know that that letter is supposed to be read before the church in Colossae. And they were supposed to swap letters with the church in Laodicea and have the letter sent to Laodicea read before the congregation Colossae and vice versa. So the use of letter carriers was very common in the first century. And a publication was something perhaps a little bit different from what we are used to in nowadays. Okay, so a publication should probably be understood as the reception and the reading of a given document before the intended recipients. So we have 1 Thessalonians 5:27. I put you under oath before the Lord to have this letter read to all the brothers. Okay, so um, it seems that the publication element comes into play here when that letter, that epistle, is read aloud before the church for everybody to hear, okay, the teachings of the apostles. And the process of letter composition would be then complete only when it was finally made public or published uh, by the act of reading it, okay? So thankfully, we do not have to rely only on the bits of information that we get from the New Testament itself. History has left us with some valuable insights into how literary works were written in the world of the New Testament. And of course, these insights from the Greco-Roman society will help us understand the New Testament. We can know more about the autographic process of the New Testament when we look at the Greco-Roman world around it. So it seems to have been common for writers to compose more than one copy of their books. So they most likely had initial drafts of a given composition, right? And that draft was sometimes sent out to friends, colleagues, who would then provide some feedback before the distribution of that work was made official. And they would also sometimes invite friends and colleagues um, to sit down, right? And they would read the composition before those friends who would then critique that composition. So publishing back then was the same as, giving copies of their work to people who were interested in the literature, and then further copies given to those people's friends and so forth. So think about publishing today, right? When we think of a hard copy kind of book, you you send the draft to a given publisher. Um, they're going to edit it, give you feedback. You're going to make those changes, send it back, and they will print it and put on the shelves for people to buy or online. However, think of social media now, right? When you want to post something, or maybe it's a picture or comments about the latest, political decision made by the president, whatever. When you want to make your opinions public that way, what is it that you do? You post them on social media, at which point your comment and your pictures are out of your control. Okay, you published it. So that's basically, okay, just a comparison, an analogy here to what we have going on in the first century. You have made your work public, right? You've published it, and at that point, it's out of your control, right? So that's how publishing was perceived for the most part in that society, right? And what can we learn about how writing looked in the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament? So sometimes dictation was part of it. Um, so dictation to a scribe with multiple revisions by friends was a practice that authors of the time used. So we have something interesting here by Pliny the Younger from the 1st century. And now I'm going to read this quote. In the first place, I revise my composition in private. Next, I read it to 2 or 3 friends and then give it to others to annotate. If I doubt the justness of their corrections, I carefully weigh them again with a friend or 2. Last of all, I recite the piece to a numerous assembly, and this is the time, if you can believe me, when I exercise the most rigid criticism, for my attention rises in proportion to my solicitude. So, of course, we don't have to take this and apply to every single composition in the Greco-Roman society, but when it comes to a literary piece like the one that Pliny is talking about, this seems to have been a very common practice, and there are other sources that we can show. Um, so this is the environment that in which the authors of the New Testament are operating. All right, it gives us an idea of how things were done back then. And publishing in the 1st century, again, could mean 2 different things. Giving copies of one's work to people who are interested in the literature, and then further copies, as we've mentioned. Maybe a bookshop as well. There are records of bookshops. So those were 2 ways of publishing something. And once the the work was distributed in one of those 2 ways, then you've lost control over your work. And it's interesting that Quintilian, again, from the 1st century, the time, of the New Testament authors, he got really frustrated because students at one point jotted down notes. Some of their students had, developed the skills into calligraphy, so they wrote down everything that Quintilian was teaching, and they honored him rashly, right, with publication. Rashly honored my work with publication and wide circulation. Now he's trying to gather all those copies, right, to make corrections, edit everything before it's in its final shape that he's happy with. So then it can be published and circulated. So again, it's another author from that period, and we can get an idea, get a sense for how things were done at the time. So in light of this, I think it's safe to say that um, the New Testament autographs, they were published when the recipients received, the book, the letter, and then read it. And then after that, it was being copied and distributed. So when you again think of Colossians and the Laodicean letter, right, which we don't have, unless you're a Roman Catholic, then you have something uh, written in Latin to fill that gap. But uh, they were supposed to receive it and read it, right, before the church. And then at that point, Colossians was published. Now, they were under apostolic direction to swap letters. What would you do, right? Let's say you are Tychicus or Epaphras or somebody there in the church of Colossae. Will you just hand over to the brothers, to the dear brothers and sisters in Laodicea, your prized letter from the Apostle Paul, the only one that you have? Or will you make copies? Revolutionary idea, let's make copies and send a copy to the church in Laodicea. We'll keep the original. So that is to say, that's just common sense, right? But that goes to say that most likely what we're looking at is the process of copying the New Testament. I'm sorry, the the letters, the books that later comprise the New Testament. Copy those books early on, right? At the very beginning of the tradition, you are already dealing with copies. Okay. All right, let's move on. So, in light of this, how would we define the autographs of the New Testament documents? Again, what is it that we at CSNTM, okay, are committed to retrieving? It's the author approved document that was sent out and then circulated. All right. And we want to go back to those autographs. All right. Now that we have a good working definition and some historical background for an autograph and, publication and circulation, we are in a better position to answer some important questions about the nature of these autographs. What language were they written in? Who wrote the autographs? And why were the autographs written anyway? So, the language of the New Testament autographs, all the evidence that we have, the earliest extant evidence that we have for the New Testament is in Greek, right? So, based on hard evidence, again, data driven approach, it was composed in Greek. There's also, a bunch of passages in the New Testament that would only make sense if those books were written in Greek. So you have sections in the Gospels like John 1:38, Mark 5:41, Acts 4:36, in which certain uh, Aramaic or Hebrew words are explained, right? So take John 1:38, Rabbi, which is translated teacher. Where are you staying? Oh, rabbi is a Hebrew word which the author needed to intervene over there to explain that it meant teacher. Perhaps his audience. There is this discussion about, are these, Gentiles, Gentile Christians, or are these Jewish Christians? Scholarship is, goes back and forth about that. But in any way, even if these are Jews, they might be Jews who are not as familiar with the Hebrew language anymore, depending on the setting in which they're living. So there was a need to explain the meaning of the word rabbi, right? So um, it means, didaskalos in Greek. It's a Greek word. So the comment would make no sense if John was written, for instance, in Hebrew, right? And again, there are other examples of that. And why were the autographs written in Greek? Of course, it has to do with this dude over there, Alexander the Great, who conquered, a big chunk of the known world around the 4th century BC. And with him, he brought Greek culture. He Hellenized the Mediterranean and beyond. So Greek became the universally spoken language of the Mediterranean world. So 1st century Palestine, of course, they knew, other languages. Aramaic was around, Hebrew was around, Latin to a certain extent, especially in Roman circles. But Greek was the common language. It's the lingua franca, right? It's interesting because what we have with Greek in the 1st century is what we have nowadays with English, right? So I'm from Brazil. I speak Portuguese that's my mother tongue. And here at the center, I'm often in communication with librarians and conservators and professors across the world who live in Germany, who live in Greece, who live in Scandinavia, who do not speak English. As English is not their first language either. But in order to communicate about these official matters and make our business transactions, we have to use English. I was watching a TV show last night, and this CIA agent was working with a Korean agent um, to free his wife from, who was kidnapped in Russia. You have 3 nationalities over there, and they are doing their business and paying ransom using English. So you get the picture. That's what we have going on in the 1st century, right? If somebody was kidnapped in the 1st century by a Roman and you are an Egyptian, using an insurance company that operates out of Jerusalem, you're not speaking Aramaic, you're not speaking Hebrew, you're not speaking Latin, you are using Greek. That is the lingua franca.
I don't think
Okay.
I've ever heard it described that way. That should be an illustration that is always used.
So, since Greek was the lingua franca, it made sense, right? It's there's no Holy Ghost Greek, as some scholars from the past would say, or others were not scholars to say today. Uh, Koine Greek was a common language of the time, just part of the evolution of Greek. So it made sense for them to write in Greek, just as if you want to write a novel today, and if you want to become famous, right, through that novel, please do not write that novel in Tagalog, or or Portuguese for that matter, or any other language that is not English, right? Because you want wide circulation, and for that it has to be English today. So that was Greek back then. So you can notice God's hand in this, because at the fullness of time, right, when the world was, from God's perspective and his plan, when things were ready for him to execute his divine plan of redemption and bring his son into the world, he sets that new covenant in motion, right? He would then author inspired scripture in a language that was widely spoken and understood across the known world, all right? And this is the map of Alexander the Great, a Great's empire, and Greek was known widely at the time. And just to give you an idea of his empire. All right, so we understand what an autograph is, what language it was written, and two more questions: who wrote the autographs? Well, we know that Jesus did not write the autographs. If Jesus did not write the New Testament, then who did it? Who done it? Well, authoritative messengers connected with eyewitness testimony. Again, let me repeat this for the sake of emphasis. It's extremely important. Authoritative messengers connected with eyewitness testimony. Okay? The apostles were the treasure keepers of the gospel. So they were the ones who were entrusted with the stewardship and message of the gospel. The documents that were recognized as New Testament scripture are either written by the apostles or those closely associated with the apostles, directly connected with the apostles, who had the authority to convey the teachings of Jesus and those stories, okay? The history around Jesus. And the final question: why were the autographs written? Well, the epistles were written because out of necessity, right? They were composed before the gospel simply because as the Jesus movement was spreading, especially under the work of Peter and Paul, churches were popping up everywhere. And where churches pop up, let me tell you something that comes with churches: problems, okay? Problems come with people. So it doesn't matter if you are redeemed, saved by Jesus, you are still a sinner and problems will abide. So churches were popping up everywhere, problems were popping up everywhere, and they still needed this body of apostolic teaching. So the apostles are writing the letters, the epistles, to address issues. Think of the epistle to the Galatians, right? They were um, suffering the bad influence of some people who were teaching them, hey, you have to do other things related to Judaism in order to actually participate in the new covenant and be saved. So it's faith plus something else. Righteousness comes through faith plus this and that. And Paul comes with the axe to cut that nonsense, uproot that thing, and he uses an epistle, right? They were having theological problems. Uh, qu- uh, my favorite example, everybody's favorite example is First Corinthians, okay? Because you have two problems over there, two categories. You have theological problems, right? People are denying the resurrection or saying it's come already. And then you have issues related to the gifts and other things. But you also have very dirty, practical problems and sins, and people dragging each other to court, and other sexual problems, sexual sins. So those things were arising in the church, and the church was not in a good position to handle those things yet because they lacked what apostolic teaching. So epistles come in place for that. All right. And some epistles were written to churches and others to individuals, as we know, to address a particular matter, such as Philemon, right? Then you have, of course, 2 John 12 is a good example of, hey, I cannot be there to deal with it, so I'm going to write a letter, right? So though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face so that our joy may be complete. So John is saying, hey, there are these problems. They need to be addressed right away. I'm going to use a letter, but I'm hoping to come soon, all right? And then the Gospels and Acts, they circulate, the Gospels especially circulated in a variety of forms. We should not think that the content of the Gospels were um, hermetically sealed in a certain way as we conceive of them today. So the content of the Gospels, I mean, if you are someone who heard Jesus teach, right? You sat under his teachings for those, give or take, 3 years. You're not part of that main body of disciples, but you saw what he did. You heard what he taught. You saw all the miracles, and you believed everything. You were a follower of Jesus. Let me go off on a limb here and suspect that you are going to be telling others about those things, right? So, orally, okay, there's the oral distribution of Jesus' tradition, okay, around the first century. Uh, Before even the gospel writers composed their accounts. So sayings and deeds of Jesus were circulating before there was any kind of written record. You also have something like creeds, okay? There are passages in the New Testament that do have the creedal kind of feature. We can think of Philippians 2, but also 1 Corinthians 15. The definition of the gospel over there very early because it's one of the earliest epistles of Paul. So not too long after his own conversion, and you already have a creedal kind of form of the gospel. So oral traditions going around, creeds already going around, and of course, verbal eyewitness testimony, which was extremely valuable in that society, or valued in that society. Uh, Still is in many societies in the Middle East. We just, in the West, prefer, I guess, the written form. But think of Papias, right? Writing in the 100s, uh, he writes, and if by chance someone who had been a follower of the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, meaning what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples. And whatever Aristian and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and abiding voice. Now, think of the contrast. In our society, we would go the opposite direction. Well, I don't. I prefer to read something. It's especially when it's published in a decent academic book, published by a very renowned publisher. I tend to trust that research or the newspaper, those publications, as opposed to the word of mouth. But for them, at least for Papias over here, he valued the word of mouth, the eyewitness testimony. And Papias is an extremely important link, okay? Because the second century, again, as I mentioned earlier, we lack hard evidence for the Greek New Testament tradition. But we have the testimony of eyewitnesses and apostolic fathers, again, the generation after the apostles and before the church fathers. So they provide this link. So people like Papias, Polycarp, they had firsthand contact with the elders that were the disciples, right? So they are then passing on that tradition in oral form to others as well, receiving that, even though there were books already, the Gospels were already written by this time, but they still preferred the word of mouth, the oral account, um, by, from a living and abiding voice who walked with them and saw the Lord. All right, so if the story of Jesus and his sayings were passed around orally and in various kinds of writing, why were the Gospels written? Of course, the apostles were coming to the end of their lives, and they had to preserve the apostolic, authoritative telling of the life of Jesus for communities that were not in contact with the eyewitnesses in both the first century and future generations. So they were dying out. And there came the need, hey, we need to record our account. Look at the Gospel of Luke, right? Amazing testimony when it comes to the need for a record, a written record. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So that's what we are trying to do at CSNTM with this curriculum, so that you may know the certainty of the things that we have received. So Luke is doing that, right? Interviewing eyewitnesses. How does he know, the way that Mary felt when she was conceived, I'm sorry, when Jesus was conceived in her womb by the Holy Spirit? How did he know, John the Baptist's reaction in his mom's womb when Mary walked up, you know, close to John the Baptist too in the womb, and John the Baptist leapt for joy inside. So all those details, Luke had to interview, and that's what he's telling us. I have been going around interviewing everybody, all the eyewitnesses, those who lived those things, in order to give you a trustworthy account. All right. So why were the autographs copied as soon as they were written? Well, uh, out of need, all right? Communities wanted copies of those authoritative documents. Authors of those epistles also made copies for themselves, but we'll have a quick talk on copies later. So to conclude our lesson on the autographs, the books of the New Testament are grounded in history. They were written, published, and circulated, okay, by different processes than we are familiar with today. They were following those conventions of the time. Um, the writers and early recipients considered the message important for preserving and spreading. And how are you involved in that task as well? And being a good steward of this message, right? What price are you willing to pay to pass down the torch to the next generations? All right, so this is the first talk of 7, the autographs, just to set things in motion. Those are the original documents that beget everything else. And next, we'll address the issue of canon. We do have some resources for further study if you're interested. Introductory level when it comes to first century Greco-Roman conventions and writing and publication. You have myths and about the autographs and by Timothy Mitchell, and then 2 other resources more intermediate advanced level for you. Thank you very much, Peter. It's been a joy. And shoot me your questions or comments
Yeah,
if you want.
perfect. Yeah, this is great, Dennis. Thanks so much for a great introductory lesson on these issues. This is great. What a great airplane level view of what's going on at the autograph level, and how the apostles themselves, and a new word for some, an amanuensis, may have been involved. I think a lot of times we unfortunately just think of our own culture and that's what the apostles lived in, but that's just not the case. Copyright was not really an issue in the early days, and I mean, there's just a lot of differences, like you mentioned, even the publication immediately leading to copies, and then even students outside of the New Testament publishing their professors' notes and him having to gather those. I mean, it's just a different world, and the oral culture that is involved there. Just such great reminders that we live in a different culture. That doesn't mean we can't benefit and can't learn, but we do need to do a little extra work sometimes to accurately understand what's going on. So these kinds of things are just so helpful. So like Dennis mentioned, if you have any questions, comments, or anything like that, you can leave them on the YouTube video. You can shoot them through on my website. You can actually try to find Dennis as well and reach out to him. Although I will say that if things go well, maybe we can have like a big question and answer episode for Dennis. Maybe we can just give him a ton of questions and he could answer all of those that relate to this. So hopefully that'll work. We have a few other episodes on this issue as well. As he said, we're going to try to keep marching along and talking about some of these issues that will be very helpful in dealing with the New Testament. So thanks for sticking with us, and we'll get you on the next one. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.